Dear students, today we will talk about histology of the organs of female reproductive system. This topic is divided into two parts. Its second part, and it includes histology of the uterus, fallopian tubes, vagina. It includes menstrual cycle and histology of the mammary gland. The first part includes histology of the ovaries, follicular growth, ovulation, corpus luteum, and also ovarian cycle and ovogenesis. And we are going to the second part of this topic, and let's go to the classification of the organs of female reproductive system. So, female reproductive system, it includes two groups of organs. There are internal and external organs, or inner and outer. And internal organs, they include ovaries, the main reproductive glands, and also there are oviducts or fallopian tubes, uterus and vagina. They are hollow organs, so they have lumen or cavity, and they have wall, so they form reproductive tract of female reproductive system. Also, there are external organs of female reproductive system and mammary glands. And today, in the second part of this topic, we will talk about histology of the oviducts, uterus and vagina, reproductive tract, and histology of the mammary glands. So, let's revise the functions of female reproductive system. It provides four basic functions. They are reproductive, endocrine, intrauterine development of the fetus, and secretion of milk. So, reproductive function is production of female gametes or oocytes or ova, and it's called ovogenesis, and it takes place in the ovaries. And a similar function also is present in male organism, which is provided by testes. It's formation of the spermatozoa, and it's called spermatogenesis. We can see that reproductive function is similar in two systems, female and male. And also another similar function, it's endocrine function, it's secretion of sex hormones. And in female organism, there are female hormones which are produced by the ovaries. There are estrogens and progesterone. And male hormones are androgens, and namely it's testosterone, and it's produced by testes. So there are two similar functions in both systems, in female and male. It's reproductive and endocrine functions. And also there are two functions which are characteristic for a female reproductive system only. It's intrauterine development of the fetus, and it's provided by the uterus. And also uterus provides delivery, childbirth. And also another function, it's secretion of milk, which is provided by the mammary gland, and it's needed for the nutrition, feeding of baby after delivery. Four basic functions are present in female reproductive system, and we'll focus on third and fourth today. And we'll begin from the reproductive tract, and it includes oviducts or fallopian tubes, uterus and vagina. There are two fallopian tubes from two sides, right and left. It's uterus. It includes body and cervix, and vagina. And those organs, they have a lot of similarities. They have wall and they have cavity or lumen, and this lumen is common for all those organs, so they form reproductive tract. And for example, spermatozoa, they pass through vagina, they enter through the cervix of uterus into the cavity of uterus, and they can go to the fallopian tubes, and they here achieve ovum, and they provide fertilization. And after the fertilization, zygote goes through the fallopian tube, through its lumen, and it achieves the uterus till 5th day during embryonic development. Now it's already blastocyst. In the tube, it's morula, and in the uterus, it's already blastocyst. And on the 7th day, it undergoes implantation. And uterus, it provides embryonic development and development of fetus, and after that it provides delivery, childbirth, and baby from uterus passes through the reproductive tract, through the cervix of uterus and vagina, and its delivery. Here we can see that those organs, they have functions which are connected with each other, and also they have a lot of similarities in their histology and anatomy. So let's look at the layered structure of their wall, and after that we will talk about differences between them. So, wall of the organs of reproductive tract are very simple, and they remind us of another hollow organs of another systems. If you remember another hollow organs such as digestive system or urinary system, it will be easy to you to study layers of the wall of reproductive tract. So there are only three layers. There is mucosa, muscularis, and adventitia or serosa. So, mucosa. What is mucosa? Mucosa usually in different organs. It contains epithelium and lamina propria. And also female reproductive tract, it has those two layers, epithelium and lamina propria. Epithelium, it provides the main functions of mucosa, and lamina propria, it underlies the epithelium, it maintains it. It contains blood vessels, nerves, which are needed for nutrition and innervation of the epithelium. And also there are lymphatic vessels which remove some fluid, and lymphatic cells, lymphocytes, and another immune cells which provide immune defense. So all those cells and structures, they are located in the loose connective tissue which underlies epithelium. And together those two layers, they are called mucosa. And mucosa of reproductive tract, it doesn't have muscularis mucosa, and also some mucosa is absent. Mucosa usually is thin, and under the mucosa there is muscularis. It's located directly under mucosa. Muscularis in female reproductive tract, it's composed of smooth muscular tissue. Here we can see those smooth myocytes, and it may form two or three layers. In the fallopian tubes, there are two layers, inner and outer, and also in vagina, and in the uterus there are three layers of muscularis or muscular layer. And the outermost layer may be adventitia, it's loose fibrous connective tissue only, and it may be serosa, it's a peritonum, which is attached to the surface of these organs, and there is mesothelium, simple squamous epithelium, and underlying connective tissue. So, if you remember features of anatomy of the organs of female reproductive system, it will be easy to you to identify which organs do have peritonum, which have, or serosa, which have adventitia. Those organs of female reproductive system which are covered with peritonum, they have serosa. Here we can see that fallopian tubes and uterus, they are covered with peritonum, they have serosa. And cervix of the uterus and vagina, they aren't covered with peritonum, and they don't have serosa, so they have adventitia instead of serosa. And it's a feature of those organs. So layers of the wall are mucosa, muscularis, and adventitia in the vagina, and particularly in the cervix of uterus, or serosa in fallopian tubes and body of uterus. And now let's look at the differences in all those organs and parts of reproductive tract. Here we can see a cross section of the fallopian tube, and here we can see mucosa, its epithelium and underlying lamina propria. Next it's muscularis, and the outermost layer in the fallopian tubes, it will be serosa or peritonum, which covers the fallopian tubes. So we will begin from the fallopian tube or oviduct. So the function of this organ, it participates in the fertilization. And here we can see ovaries, and each month during the ovulation, ovum is released from the follicle, Graafian follicle of the ovary, and ovum goes to the abdominal cavity, but the poles of the ovaries, they are tightly surrounded by the fimbria of fallopian tubes. Here we can see processes of the fallopian tubes. Here we can see them processes like fingers or villi, and they surround pole of the ovary, and ovocyte or ovum, it goes directly to the ampulla of fallopian tube. So during the ovulation, ovum goes to the fallopian tube and it takes this ovum. And here in the ampulla of fallopian tube, ovum is waiting for the possible fertilization. So in one of the ovaries, usually there is right or left ovary, only one follicle ovulates, And in one of the fallopian tubes, there is oocyte surrounded by follicular cells, by corona radiata, and it's waiting for the possible fertilization. And if there are spermatozoa, they pass through vagina, through the cervix of uterus, through the cavity of uterus, and they are going through the fallopian tube, and they achieve the ovum in the ampulla of fallopian tube. There is a chemotaxis. Ovum, it releases some attractive substances which attract spermatozoa to it, so they find the place of localization of the ovum, and ovum is waiting here for them, and fertilization may occur here when they meet each other. It's contact phase of the fertilization, which takes place in the fallopian tube. And after the fertilization, zygote goes through the fallopian tube to the cavity of uterus. It takes about 5 days, and embryo is called morula in the fallopian tube. When it achieves uterus, it's already blastocyst, and till 7th day it undergoes implantation, and now it's called blastocyst, and embryo is attached to the wall of uterus for the further development. So it's the main function of the fallopian tube. It participates in the fertilization because ova during ovulation, they are going to the fallopian tubes, and also they are way of the spermatozoa to the place of fertilization, and also they are way for the embryo during first week of embryogenesis to the cavity of uterus. And if there are some contractions or some scars in the fallopian tube, embryo sometimes cannot pass through the fallopian tube, and it undergoes implantation in the fallopian tube, and it's a complication which is called extrauterine pregnancy or tubular pregnancy, and it requires surgical removal of the fallopian tube. So now let's look at the histology of the wall of fallopian tube. It has 3 layers, which are typical for the organs of reproductive system. So the wall, it includes mucosa, the innermost layer. It includes muscularis and serosa. Why serosa? Because fallopian tubes, they are covered with peritonum, and peritonum, when it's attached to the organ, it's called serosa. So here we can see 3 layers. It's mucosa, it's epithelium of mucosa and lamina propria. It's muscularis. It has 2 layers, inner circular and outer is longitudinal. And the outermost layer is serosa, which includes mesothelium and a thin layer of loose fibrous connective tissue. And here we can see cross-section of the fallopian tube. 2 images, they are microphotographs. And here we can see folded mucosa with numerous folds. It's muscularis, next layer, and the outermost is serosa. So let's begin from mucosa, from the innermost layer. And mucosa, it includes epithelium and lamina propria. So let's look at this epithelium. Is it simple or stratified? It has 1 layer of cells, so it's simple. And let's look at the shape of the cells. Cells are tall and they are thin, so we classify them as columnar cells. So this epithelium is simple columnar. And cells are having cilia on their apical poles, so epithelium is simple columnar ciliated. And here we can find some ciliated cells. Those cilia are movable, special processes, and they are special organelles. And also between them we can see cells without cilia, with a completely smooth apical surface, and they are secretory cells. They secrete some amount of fluid which fills the lumen of the fallopian tube. Some fluid fills the cavity of fallopian tubes. And 2 types of cells are present here. So why cilia are present in the fallopian tubes, in the epithelium of fallopian tubes? Here we can see ovum surrounded by the follicular cells. Those small yellow bubbles are the follicular cells, and inside a huge round cell, it's ovum surrounded by corona radiata cells, and it's located in the ampulla of fallopian tube, and spermatozoa are going to it. But cilia of the surface of the cells. They are movable and they help to move ovum surrounded by follicular cells to the place of fertilization. Here we can see yellow cells on this picture. They are follicular cells or cells of corona radiata, and above them there is an ovum. And those movable finger-like processes of the cells, they are called cilia, and they are moving, and they move this ovum to the place of fertilization. And after that, also they help to move zygote, developing zygote, morula, and blastocyst to the cavity of uterus. And here we can see movement of cilia, which are moving ovum with corona radiata. And under the epithelium there is lamina propria, a thin layer of loose fibrous connective tissue, and it contains blood vessels, nerves, so typical structure of lamina propria, which can be found everywhere in mucosa of the hollow organs. So it's basis of the epithelium, which contains blood vessels, nerves, and some components of immune system. Next, together, epithelium and lamina propria, they form mucosa, entire layer of mucosa. And mucosa of fallopian tube is folded. It forms very complicated and sophisticated folds. Here we can see their appearance, those folds, and they are branched. And those folds, they fill entire lumen of the fallopian tube. So when zygote or ovum is present here, it will not be lost, because in any place it has attachment to the surface of epithelium. Here we can see folds of mucosa, and in any place ovum or zygote will be supported by the epithelium of the fallopian tube. Under the mucosa there is muscularis. Here we can see it, and muscularis, it has two layers. Inner is circular and outer is longitudinal, and it's smooth muscular tissue. Why muscularis is present there? Because fallopian tubes, they are able for contractions, and those contractions are called peristalsis of fallopian tube, and this peristalsis also helps in the movement of spermatozoa to ovum, of ovum to spermatozoa, and also they help to move zygote and develop an embryo to the uterus. So together, cilia of epithelium and muscularis, peristaltic contractions of muscularis, they help to provide the functions of fallopian tubes. And the outermost layer is serosa or peritonum. It has typical structure of serosa, which can be found everywhere in the organs, hollow organs which have serosa. So it contains loose fibrous connective tissue, thin layer, and mesothelium. It's simple squamous epithelium which covers this serosa. And now we are going to uterus, to histology of uterus. So the main function of uterus is development of fetus, and also corresponding function of it provides delivery or childbirth. Contractions of uterus, they push out baby to outer environment, and baby passes through the following parts of female reproductive tract, through the cervix of uterus and vagina. So let's look at the structure of uterus. Uterus in anatomy is divided into body of uterus and cervix of uterus. So upper third it's body and lower third it's cervix. And also uterus is hollow or luminal organ, and it has wall which has layered structure. So uterus, as well as other organs of female reproductive tract, it has three layers, and in the body of uterus they are mucosa, muscularis, and serosa. Here we can see mucosa, muscularis, and serosa. So those layers, they have special own names which are used in the clinical practice usually, and let's look at those names. So mucosa of uterus, it has own special name. It's endometrium. Here we can see mucosa, and it's called endometrium. Muscularis of uterus, it's called myometrium. And serosa of uterus, it's perimetrium. So 3 layers, endo, myo, and perimetrium, they form the wall of uterus. And we can use both types of names, mucosa muscularis and serosa, or endo, myo, perimetrium. They are used for uterus only, for body of uterus, and they are more accepted in the clinical practice. And here we can say endometrium, it's mucosa of uterus. Next, it's myometrium, muscularis of the uterus, and serosa or perimetrium, it's outermost layer of uterus. And here we can see on the microphotograph, it's endometrium, myometrium, middle layer, and serosa or perimetrium. And also there is a term parametrium. So what is it? Let's look at the covering of uterus by serosa, by peritonum. Here we can see bladder, body of uterus, its cervix of uterus and vagina, its rectum, and visceral layer of peritonum. It covers apical surface of the bladder, upper surface of the urinary bladder. It covers anterior, upper, and posterior surfaces of uterus and forms rectouterine pouch and goes to the intestines. And we can see that there is a region in the cervix of uterus which hasn't this peritoneal covering. So in this place it hasn't serosa, and in this place it's filled with connective tissue, loose fibrous connective tissue, and also usually there is adipose tissue in this region. So this place is filled with some tissues, and it's called parametrium. It's special name for this region, so we can call parametrium as Adventitia of the cervix of the uterus. So there are special names for mucosa muscularis and serosa of uterus, and also parametrium, which may be described as an adventitia of the cervix of uterus, place of cervix which hasn't peritoneal covering. And now let's look at the structure of those organs. So the outermost layer is serosa, it's peritonum which is attached to the wall of uterus, and it has typical structure, it's loose fibrous connective tissue and mesothelium. So it's continuation of the visceral layer of peritonum, and it covers body of uterus. Here we can see the outermost layer, it's connective tissue and simple squamous epithelium called mesothelium. So it's perimetrium. And here we can see perimetrium, which covers the surface of uterus, its mesothelium, and thin layer of loose fibrous connective tissue. And on two sides of the uterus, there are double layers of peritonum. Here we can see one layer, it covers the posterior surface of uterus, and another layer, it covers anterior surface of uterus. And here on two sides, we can find double layered peritonum and its ligamentum latum uteri, or broad ligament, on two sides, on right and left sides of uterus. So they maintain uterus, and they are formed by the layers of peritonum. So here we can see beginning of the broad ligament and its perimetrium, which covers the uterus. Next layer, it's the most developed layer, the thickest layer in the uterus. It's called myometrium, and it's composed of smooth muscular tissue and with inclusions with loose fibrous connective tissue. And here we can see myometrium, or muscularis of the uterus. And it includes 3 layers: inner, intermediate, and outer. Here we can see inner, intermediate, and outer. So those layers are formed by smooth muscular tissue. It's involuntary, and also we can see that smooth myocytes, they have different directions of localization, and in different textbooks you can find a little bit different information. So usually they are oblique, but inner and outer layers, they tend to be longitudinal, they are more longitudinal, and middle it's closer to the circular layer, but they all are oblique, and they are in different directions, and it results in the contraction of entire uterus. For example, during delivery, when entire uterus is contracted and it pushes out the baby into vagina. So 3 layers: inner, intermediate, and outer. And intermediate layer, it has a very interesting feature. It contains big blood vessels. So blood vessels, magistral blood vessels in the uterus, they are located in the middle muscular layer. And here we can see those muscles and vessels. So this layer is called vascular intermediate layer of myometrium. Those layer which is located under mucosa is also called submucosal, and layer which is located above the vascular layer is called supravascular. So submucosal or inner vascular or intermediate and supravascular or outer layers of myometrium. And here we can see them. And here we can see inner layer or submucosal because it's located under mucosa, vascular layer, it contains big blood vessels, and supravascular, it's located above the vascular layer. And also very interesting and important feature, its localization of big blood vessels. Their branches are going to the endometrium and they provide nutrition of endometrium, and during pregnancy they provide nutrition of placenta and developing embryo. And we can see that blood vessels are located here between two muscular layers, inner and outer. And also muscles are located in the intermediate layer. So what is the reason of this localization of blood vessels? And this reason is very important for the clinical practice. During the menstruation, endometrium is particularly removed. It undergoes desquamation. And also during the delivery, placenta also undergoes desquamation, and some part of the endometrium is removed from the uterus. And usually there is bleeding. It's normal condition, bleeding during the menstruation and bleeding during the delivery and after the delivery. But this bleeding shouldn't be very pronounced, and woman shouldn't lost too many blood from the damaged blood vessels. And those blood vessels which carry blood to endometrium, they are branches of the biggest blood vessels which are located in the myometrium. So this localization of myometrium, of the blood vessels in myometrium, is needed for the compression of blood vessels. After the delivery or during the menstruation, uterus is contracted, and myometrium muscles, they form the tension, they compress blood vessels, and they stop the bleeding from the damaged surface of the endometrium. So this localization is needed to prevent extra bleeding. So after the delivery, after removal of placenta, uterus is contracted, and this contraction, it pushes the blood vessels, it compresses them, and it stops the bleeding. And the same thing, but in the smaller volume, happens during every menstruation when some amount of endometrium has been removed, uterus is contracted, and it makes a compression on the blood vessels, and it prevents extra bleeding. So this localization of blood vessels is very important. And muscular cells, they are controlled by oxytocin, hormone which is produced in anterior hypothalamus, and this hormone is released in posterior lobe of hypophysis. It's neurohypophysis. And target cells for oxytocin in reproductive systems are smooth myocytes, and target cells of myometrium, muscular cells of myometrium, they also are target cells for oxytocin. And also target cells are another cells of muscularis of reproductive tract, and also myoepithelial cells in mammary glands. We will talk about this today. And also there are target cells for oxytocin in male reproductive system. There are myocytes of male reproductive tract, all those canaliculi, tubules, they have smooth muscular cells in their wall, and they are contracted under influence of oxytocin, and it helps in the ejaculation. And also prostate gland is contracted, smooth myocytes of prostate gland are contracted under influence of oxytocin. So traditionally female hormone also may be found in male reproductive system, and it has target cells not only in the female but also in male reproductive system. So during the delivery, when there is a deficiency of contraction of myometrium, doctors should give to patient some dose of oxytocin to increase contraction of muscles. They will compress blood vessels in the myometrium and the bleeding will be stopped. And here we can see myometrium, there are smooth myocytes, and here we can see inner, middle and outer layers of myometrium. Here we can see inner, middle it contains big blood vessels, and its outer layer of myometrium. And myometrium undergoes hypertrophy and hyperplasia during pregnancy. Hypertrophy is increased in volume of cells, and hyperplasia is increased number of cells, and it's controlled by progesterone, which activates all changes caused by pregnancy. And also oxytocin, it results in the contraction of myometrium. So here we can see changes of the volume of uterus, and almost all changes which happen, they occur in muscular tissue, and also endometrium, it undergoes some changes during the pregnancy. And now let's go to the innermost layer of the uterus. It's endometrium, or mucosa of uterus. And endometrium, it consists of simple columnar epithelium, here we can see, and cells are maybe ciliated and secretory cells. And also there is a thin layer of loose connective tissue which forms lamina propria. So it's inner layer of uterus which is called endometrium, or mucosa of uterus. And let's look at this picture. It's inner lining of uterus, it's lumen of uterus, and there is epithelium, and under the epithelium there is lamina propria, loose fibrous connective tissue. And let's look at this epithelium. It forms very deep invaginations, and those invaginations are called uterine glands. Here we can see all those tubules which are going to the stroma, connective tissue stroma, they are called uterine glands. So epithelium, it forms uterine glands, and they are surrounded by connective tissue. And according to the classification, the glands of uterus, they are simple, tubular, unbranched. Here we can see tubular, unbranched, and simple glands. So here we can see glands of the endometrium. We can see them, and it's lumen of the uterus, and it's endometrium, or mucosa of uterus. And endometrium is subject to cyclic changes that result in menstruation. So there are cyclic changes each month, and this endometrium, it undergoes changes, and it's particularly removed each month. And also it's involved in the formation of placenta, and it's removed together with placenta, particularly removed with placenta after the delivery. So endometrium, it provides very important functions, cyclic changes, and also it's involved in the formation of placenta. And according to the features of the functioning, endometrium is divided into two compartments, or into two layers. It's basal layer and functional layer. And here we can see basal layer and functional layer. So here we can see it's covering epithelium. It forms the glands of the uterine wall of the uterine endometrium. There are glands, simple, tubular, unbranched. And here we can see they are bottoms. They are located deep in the endometrium. And here we can see myometrium. And it's connective tissue stroma between the glands. So both layers, they contain epithelium and connective tissue stroma, or lamina propria, in the functional and in the basal layer. But basal layer, it contains only the bottoms of the uterine glands. Here we can see those bottoms, and bodies of the glands and superficial epithelium are included in the functional layer. So it's functional and it's the basal layer. So why do we divide basal and functional layer? Why we distinguish them? Because the zona functionalis or functional layer, this upper layer, it's the luminal part of the endometrium, and it's removed during the menstruation. Each month this layer is removed, and also this layer undergoes the changes during cycle. So during cycle it grows, it undergoes the changes, and each month it's removed from the uterus. And basal layer, it remains here, and it doesn't undergo any changes, and it remains in the uterus. So functional layer, newly formed functional layer forms, it undergoes the changes, and it's removed during the menstruation. Next month, new functional layer grows, and it's result of the regeneration which is provided by the basal layer. New functional layer grows, and again it's removed from the uterus. So only functional layer grows in cyclic pattern, and only functional layer undergoes the changes. It's sensitive for the female hormones, estrogens and progesterone, so it undergoes the changes. And only the functional layer is removed during the menstruation. And also functional layer is involved in the formation of placenta. Embryo is going to the placenta, it's embedded to the functional layer. So functional layer is included in the formation of placenta, and each month it's removed during the menstruation, and also during the delivery. Functional layer is removed together with placenta, and this process is a like process which happens during the menstruation. So everything what happens in the uterus, cyclic changes or changes during the pregnancy, changes, removal of the endometrium during menstruation, or removal of endometrium during the delivery, it happens in the functional layer, upper layer. And basal layer remains the same during all the life, and it's not removed from the uterus. It's located under the functional layer, and it provides regeneration of the functional layer. So there is functional and basal layer, and basal layer or zona basalis, it's deep portion of the endometrium. It contains the bottoms of the uterine glands, and it's the regenerative zone for the zona functionalis. After the removal of the endometrium during the menstruation, functional layer of endometrium, or after the removal of placenta with functional layer of endometrium, the basal layer, it provides regeneration of the endometrium. So two basic layers, and later we will see what are the changes in those layers and what are the features of their nutrition. So here we can see covering epithelium. It forms uterine gland, and it goes deeper, and it's zona functionalis or functional layer, and it's a deep layer or basal layer or zona basalis. So here we can see two layers of the endometrium. And also those layers, they have different sources of the nutrition, and let's look at those sources. So here we can see myometrium. It's located deeper under the endometrium, and we remember that in the muscular layer of the myometrium, in the middle muscular layer, there are magistral arteries, and especially there are arcuate arteries. Here we can see one here. And those arteries, they are given radial branches which are going to the endometrium. Here you can see a radial branch of the arcuate artery. And radial branch, it gives two kinds of branches. There are straight arteries and spiral arteries. They are divided into two kinds according to their shape. Straight arteries, they are straight, and spiral, they have spiral coiled shape. And also we can see that zona basalis or basal layer, it receives blood from straight arteries, and functional layer, it receives blood only from the spiral arteries. So different layers of the endometrium, they receive blood from different sources, and later we will see what is the result of those different sources of nutrition. And here we can see it's covering epithelium, it forms glands, its basal layer or zona basalis, and its functional layer or zona functionalis, and its myometrium. And here we can see arcuate artery, and it forms the radial branch. And there are two branches, or two kinds of branches: straight arteries, which are going to the basal layer, and spiral arteries, which are going to the functional layer. And their branches, they provide nutrition of the functional layer. So here we can see two kinds of branches. And also these arteries, they are involved in the mechanism of the menstruation, and later we will talk about this. So here we can see uterine glands, spiral arteries and their branches, small branches which provide nutrition of the functional layer, and straight arteries, they provide nutrition of the basal layer. And in the functional layer there are cyclic changes which are caused by the ovarian hormones, estrogens and progesterone, and those cyclic changes of endometrium are called the menstrual cycle. So now let's talk about menstrual cycle. Here we can see endometrium, and its appearance during the cycle is different in different phases of the menstrual cycle. So let's look what are those changes, and you should know that those changes, they occur only in the functional layer, and basal layer it remains the same. So first of all, let's revise ovarian cycle. It's cyclic changes which occur in the ovaries under influence of hormones of adenohypophysis. And there are two hormones of adenohypophysis. It's FSH, or follicle stimulating hormone, and LH, or luteinizing hormone. During follicular phase, which lasts for 2 weeks, there is FSH production by adenohypophysis, and it activates follicle growth, and folliculae, they produce estrogens, and it's called follicular phase. And estrogens, they have target cells in the functional layer of endometrium, and later we'll see what are the changes which are caused by estrogens. And the middle of the ovarian cycle is ovulation. It lasts for some hours. It's controlled by LH. It's activated by LH release, and it activates ovulation. It's release of the ovum from the mature follicle. And also there is luteal phase, which is controlled by LH. LH is produced by adenohypophysis. It activates formation of corpus luteum, and corpus luteum produces progesterone. And if you need more detailed description of the ovarian cycle, please look at the first part of the female reproductive system of this topic. And let's look at the cyclic changes of the hormones. So in the follicular phase, which takes about 2 weeks, there is FSH in the adenohypophysis, and it activates growth of the follicles, and follicles, they produce estrogen, and level of estrogen increases, and it achieves the peak, and it activates ovulation via release of LH. LH is released as a response to high level of estrogen. It means that ovary is ready for ovulation. So adenohypophysis releases peak ovulatory quota of LH, and it activates ovulation. Ovum is released from the Graafian follicle, and remains of the Graafian follicle after the ovulation, they form corpus luteum, and it's controlled by LH. And luteal phase, it lasts for 2 weeks, and corpus luteum, it produces progesterone, and here we can see high level of progesterone, and also there are estrogens which are produced by the corpus luteum. And if pregnancy doesn't occur, progesterone falls, and as well as estrogen. And here we can see low levels of all hormones, because corpus luteum is replaced by corpus albicans, and it activates menstruation in the uterus, and also it activates production of new amount of FSH. So FSH stimulates growth of new follicles, and this cycle is repeated. And there are some levels of regulation. So the highest level is adenohypophysis, and there is cyclic production of FSH and LH, luteinizing hormone LH and follicle stimulating hormone or FSH. And it's cyclic pattern of their production, which takes place in female organism after the puberty, and in male organism those hormones also are present, but they have continuous pattern of production, and they have target cells in testes. Target cells for FSH are Sertoli cells, and target cells for LH are Leydig cells. So cyclic production of FSH and LH, it results in the ovarian cycle. Ovaries, they produce estrogens during first 2 weeks and progesterone during luteal phase, also during 2 weeks. So first half of the ovarian cycle, it's secretion of estrogens, and second half it's secretion of progesterone. And those hormones, they have target cells in the uterus, and there are cyclic changes in the endometrium, in the functional layer of endometrium in the uterus, and those changes are called menstrual or uterine cycle. So the highest level is adenohypophysis, middle layer is ovary and ovarian hormones, and the lowest level it's uterus and changes in the endometrium. And results of the changes in endometrium are seen as a menstrual cycle. So those cycles, ovarian and menstrual or uterine cycle, they are related and they form common cycle, which is called ovarian and menstrual cycle. So you should know that those cycles, they aren't distinct cycles which happen in different parts of the body and without any connection. No, those cycles, they are connected with each other, and menstrual uterine cycle, it's a result of the ovarian cycle. So ovaries, they control changes in the uterus. So the menstrual cycle, it includes 3 phases, which are menstrual, postmenstrual, and premenstrual phase. Menstrual, it's desquamation phase, it's beginning of the menstrual cycle, and usually we count days of the menstrual cycle beginning from the first day of the menstruation. And its desquamation phase, it takes about 3 to 7 days in different features, and also later we'll talk about bleeding and in other features of this menstrual phase. After the menstrual phase, there is postmenstrual or proliferative phase. It corresponds to the follicular phase in the ovaries. When follicles in ovaries are growing, they activate production of estrogens, and estrogens, they result in the proliferative phase of the endometrium or postmenstrual phase, and it lasts till the ovulation. And after the ovulation, there is a premenstrual phase or secretory phase or luteal, because this phase is under control of LH, of progesterone, which is produced under control of LH. So here we can see 3 phases: menstrual, postmenstrual, and premenstrual. And let's look at the changes which occur. Here we can see different phases of the ovarian and menstrual cycle. Here we can see the highest level, it's hypophysis, adenohypophysis, which produces FSH and LH, ovary, and uterus. And you can make a notes because it's important diagram which shows all the phases. So in ovary, there is follicular phase during which estrogens are produced and released, ovulation, and luteal phase during which progesterone is produced and released. And in the uterus, there is menstrual phase. It corresponds to early follicular phase. It's a phase where when desquamation takes place. Postmenstrual phase, it corresponds to middle and late follicular phase till ovulation, and it includes regeneration, proliferation, and resting phase. Later we will talk about them. And after the ovulation in the uterus, there is premenstrual phase or phase of secretion, and it corresponds to luteal phase in ovaries. And also day 1 to 3, it's menstrual phase, it's desquamation. Days 3 till 5 it's regeneration, 5 till 11 proliferation, 11 till 15 it's resting phase. On 15th day, 14th, 15th in different cases there is an ovulation, and from 15th day till 28th day there is a premenstrual or secretory phase of the uterine cycle. So we take average duration of the menstrual cycle is 28 days, and about 60% of women they have this duration. But according to different duration, different phases they take more or less time. And usually luteal phase is fixed; it takes about 2 weeks. And follicular phase usually may be different, shorter or longer, and it is a result of different amount of estrogens and level. We'll see how estrogens affect the postmenstrual and menstrual phases. So let's begin from the postmenstrual phase, this phase, and I will begin from the resting phase, so phase right before the ovulation. And here we can see endometrium in the resting phase, and the postmenstrual phase it lasts till the ovulation, and between menstruation and ovulation. And endometrium in this phase it hasn't any features. Glands are tubular, they are straight. It's important, and they are under control of estrogens which are produced by the follicles. So here we can see resting phase before the ovulation, so endometrium has this appearance. And here we can see postmenstrual phase. Glands are tubular, unbranched, and they are mainly straight, and the endometrium is getting ready for the ovulation. And after the ovulation, there is a beginning of premenstrual phase or phase of secretion, and it's activated by progesterone. So why this phase is important? Because there is ovulation. It's between second and third weeks. And after the ovulation, pregnancy may occur if fertilization occurs. And we remember that it takes 7 days to get to the uterus and to be attached for the blastocyst. So during first week after the ovulation, embryo will migrate from the fallopian tube to the uterus, and uterus is getting ready for the possible pregnancy, and it provides the changes in the functional layer of endometrium when functional layer may accept the blastocyst during the implantation. It will provide implantation and also formation of the placenta during the pregnancy. So there are changes which correspond to the preparation of uterus to the possible pregnancy. And in the postmenstrual phase, the glands are straight, and after the ovulation, under influence of progesterone, we can see the following changes. So, corpus luteum produces progesterone, and under the influence of progesterone, those glands, they begin to produce mucus. They secrete mucus, and they begin to become coiled. Here we can see coiled glands. They are spiral or coiled. Before they were straight, and after the ovulation in secretory phase, they are coiled. They are enlarged in volume, in size. They are actively producing mucus, and this mucus may be released from uterus through vagina, and it's phase of secretion, and it's controlled by the corpus luteum hormone, which is called progesterone. So now uterus is getting ready for the possible pregnancy. Glands, they produce mucus, which will be needed for the nutrition of embryo during the implantation, and also there are decidual cells in the stroma which will be used by blastocyst for the histotrophic type of nutrition. It will receive nutrients from the decidual cells, and those changes they occur in the premenstrual phase. So the uterine glands enlarge and produce the mucus secret, and the stromal cells they transformate into decidual cells rich in glycogen. And here we can see appearance of endometrium during secretory phase. Here we can see coiled or wavy glands. they are spiral, they were straight and now they are wavy, and it's the phase of secretion. Here we can see this secretory phase in the endometrium. So this endometrium is soft, it's loose, and it's ready for the possible implantation. And if pregnancy doesn't occur, corpus luteum undergoes involution. It becomes to be corpus albicans, and progesterone level falls, as well as level of estrogens. And all those levels, they fall. And also you should know that hormones, progesterone and estrogens, they control tonus of the blood vessels of endometrium. So blood vessels, they are sensitive for progesterone and estrogen. And those spiral arteries, they are very sensitive for progesterone and estrogen, and those hormones, they keep them in opened condition. And when level of all hormones falls, it results in the changes of those arteries. So spiral arteries, they undergo contraction. It's spasm of the spiral artery. They are contracted, and this contraction lasts for some hours. So spiral arteries, they are sensitive for the level of hormones, and after fall of the level of hormones, they were contracted. What will be a result of this? It results in the ischemia, blood deficiency, and oxygen deficiency in the functional layer of the endometrium. Those blood vessels, they don't receive enough blood, and entire functional layer suffers from hypoxia. But not the basal layer, because basal layer, it has own straight arteries which remain open, and basal layer, it receives nutrition from the straight arteries, but not the functional layer which receives nutrients, which receives blood from the spiral arteries. So here we can see that different sources of blood supply in different layers, they result in the ischemia or in the functional layer only. And this functional layer, it undergoes ischemia, hypoxia, and in some hours it dies. So it's necrosis. Necrosis occurs in the functional layer. And in some hours after this, spiral artery is relaxed. It's relaxed, and blood again goes here. And this layer is already dead, and basal layer is alive. So what will happen if blood will come here through the spiral arteries? It will not go to the functional layer, because this layer is dead, and blood vessels of the functional layer are already collapsed. So they will be broken, and this blood will go between functional and basal layers, between alive basal layer and dead functional layer. And here we can see hemorrhage or hematoma. It's cavities filled with blood. There are cavities filled with blood, and blood comes here from the spiral arteries. And this blood, it separates basal layer from the functional, and these layers, they were separated, and functional layer, it's desquamated. This collecting blood, it pushes out functional layer, and it's removed together with some amount of blood. So during the menstruation, there are particles of the functional layer together with blood which are removed from the uterus. And let's look how it's provided. So blood is accumulated here, and it pushes out dead functional layer, and it's together with blood is removed, it's released from the uterus, and it's released together with blood, because bleeding, it remains from the spiral arteries. Some contraction of the myometrium, it helps to compress these arteries to reduce the bleeding, and main aim of the menstruation is to remove functional layer which was ready for the possible pregnancy, and to produce new functional layer for next month. blood is released, and after that the surface of the endometrium, it's open wound, here we can see, and some blood vessels, they remain opened. And after some days, this part of endometrium, it undergoes regeneration. And how many time it will take, how many time it will be bleeding. So when this surface will be covered, completely covered with epithelium, the bleeding will be stopped. So exactly menstrual phase, it takes from first to third days, when removal of the functional endometrium is taking place. But bleeding lasts for 5, sometimes 7, 8 days, because during the phase of regeneration, the following phase, there are sources of bleeding, and it's not the phase of desquamation, it's already phase of regeneration, the next phase. So here we can see that desquamation or menstrual phase, it's removal of the functional layer, which is caused by the changes and features of the blood supply of basal and functional layers. So after the removal of the functional layer, there are only remains of the uterine glands. There are bottoms of uterine glands, and they are present in the basal layer. And after that, in the ovaries, new follicles are growing, because FSH is activated and it activates growth of new follicles, and follicles, they produce small amounts of estrogens. And those small amounts of estrogens, they increase and they activate proliferated processes in the endometrium, so they activate regeneration of the endometrium, and those target cells, they are frequently dividing, and they provide regeneration of the functional layer, and new functional layer develops. And this process is controlled by estrogens, which are produced by the developing follicula. And sometimes folliculi are growing very slowly, and it results in very slow regeneration of the uterine functional layer of endometrium. So this phase of regeneration, when some bleeding takes place, it will be extremely prolonged, and it will result in the prolongation of the phase of bleeding. So removal of endometrium, it will take about 3 days as usual in usual menstrual cycle, but the following days, when regeneration takes place, they will be more numerous. So when phase of bleeding is prolonged, it is a sign of deficiency of estrogens, and it may occur especially in teenagers, in young girls, when a small amount of follicles is growing, or follicles, they don't produce enough amounts of estrogens. So in those cases, extra amounts of estrogens, medicines containing estrogens, may be given to reduce this problem. And after that, there is continuation of the growth of endometrium. It's called proliferation, when endometrium is growing, and it's also controlled by estrogens. And after that, during some days, endometrium is not growing, it's resting phase, and endometrium is getting ready for the ovulation. And after the ovulation, glands, they become to be coiled, and they produce mucus, and they are waiting for the next menstruation, when level of estrogens and progesterone falls, and new spasm of the spiral arteries happens, and ischemia and removal of the functional layer occurs. So here we can see menstrual phase, it's removal of the functional layer of endometrium, blood hemorrhages, which push out particles of the functional layer of endometrium. It's postmenstrual phase, it's regeneration of endometrium, and during few days after the menstrual phase, there is a bleeding because of regeneration of the endometrium. And here we can see growth of endometrium, its proliferation, and before the ovulation, there is a resting phase. And after that there is a premenstrual phase or a phase of secretion when glands are enlarged, they are coiled, and they are controlled by progesterone, and they are producing mucus, and they are waiting for the possible implantation. And if the implantation doesn't occur, this layer is removed, and here we can see menstrual phase and new functional layer of endometrium grows. And here we can see menstrual phase. It corresponds to beginning of the follicular phase. It's early follicular phase. And estrogen, it activates regeneration of endometrium, and after that it activates growth of endometrium. So follicles are growing, level of estrogen grows, and also endometrium grows, and thickness of endometrium increases. And after that, progesterone, it activates secretion in the endometrium. And when progesterone and estrogen's levels fall, it results in the beginning of the menstrual phase. And during this phase, FSH is activated. It activates growth of new follicles. And when level of estrogens is high enough to provide regeneration, the bleeding is stopped. So early proliferative phase, it also is followed by bleeding. It's during the regeneration when estrogens are trying to heal this wound after the removal of the functional layer. And here we can see follicular phase in the ovaries. And in the uterus, early follicular phase corresponds to the menstrual phase. It's day 1 to 3. And after that, there is postmenstrual phase. When estrogen level is high enough, they activate regeneration. It's day 3 till 5. But all these days, they are including the bleeding. And this regeneration phase may be longer according to the level of estrogens, or sometimes it's shorter when level of estrogen is high. After that, there is proliferation, growth of the endometrium, and after that there is a resting phase. And those 3 phases, they are called together postmenstrual phase. And next, it's premenstrual phase, which is controlled by progesterone. It's secretion, which corresponds to luteal phase in the ovary. So here we can see growth of the follicles and postmenstrual phase in the endometrium, growth, proliferation, and after that there is a phase of secretion when corpus luteum is active, and here we can see secretory endometrium. And after the involution of corpus luteum, when it becomes to be corpus albicans, desquamation of endometrium occurs, and regeneration of endometrium begins when follicles begin their growth. Follicles are growing, endometrium also is growing, and after the ovulation, corpus luteum is secreting, as well as endometrium is also secreting. And corpus luteum progesterone, which is produced by corpus luteum, also has target cells in the mammary glands, and some women, they can feel enlarging and some pain feelings in mammary glands before the menstruation. It's result of the influence of corpus luteum. Progesterone, it has target cells also in mammary glands, so they may be a little bit enlarged and a little bit painful before the menstruation. And level of progesterone falls if pregnancy doesn't occur, and new desquamation, new menstruation begins. So this cycle is repeated, and the highest level of regulation of this menstrual cycle is the hypophysis, which is controlled by hypothalamus, part of both endocrine and nervous systems. So here we can see levels of the regulation: hypothalamus and brain, next hypophysis, next ovaries, and next its uterus. And those changes, they occur in the body of uterus, in the endometrium, but also uterus, it has cervix, and it has some features of the structure. And cervix uteri, it has vaginal portion, here we can see, and it has cervical canal. And also it has layered structure. It has mucosa, muscularis, and mainly adventitia, because serosa, it doesn't achieve the cervix, so it's adventitia. And the vaginal portion is covered by stratified squamous non-keratinized epithelium. It's epithelium of mucosa, which is continued into epithelium of vagina. And cervical canal, it's lined by simple columnar epithelium, which is continuation of the epithelium of body of uterus. And here, near the isthmus of the cervix uteri, those two epithelia are meeting each other. Here we can see cervical canal. Its histological slide, and this canal, it has simple columnar epithelium at its vaginal portion, and its beginning of the cervical canal, and here it's covered with stratified squamous non-keratinized epithelium. And in some cases, this stratified squamous non-keratinized epithelium may be replaced by simple columnar, which is present in the canal, and those places will have a red shade, and it's known as pseudoerosia of the cervix uteri. And usual erosion of the cervix uteri, it's removal of some thickness of mucosa, especially epithelium. And here we can see its epithelium of cervix uteri, its vaginal portion, and its stratified squamous non-keratinized, and its epithelium of the cervical canal, and its simple columnar, and its continuation of the epithelium of endometrium, and its lamina propria with cervical glands, and under it there is a muscular layer. Cervix uteri, it's continued into vagina, the last organ of female reproductive tract, and it has layers which are similar to another layers of another organs of female reproductive tract. There is mucosa, muscularis, and adventitia. Here we can see mucosa, it's muscularis, and it's adventitia. Adventitia because vagina is not covered with peritonum. So mucosa. Mucosa of vagina has stratified squamous non-keratinized epithelium. It needs more mechanical protection, and this epithelium is continued into cervix uteri. And after this epithelium, there is lamina propria. It's loose fibrous connective tissue. Next layer, it's muscularis. It has smooth muscular layer, smooth muscular tissue. It has inner circular and outer longitudinal layer, and outer layer is usually well developed, and also the outermost layer, it's adventitia, it's loose connective tissue. Muscularis in vagina, it's smooth muscular tissue, it's involuntary, and entire vagina as well as rectum, they are surrounded by perineal muscles, and those muscles, they are skeletal, they are voluntary, so they form voluntary sphincters, but all muscles of vagina are smooth, they are involuntary. And here we can see stratified squamous epithelium, which covers mucosa, and under the mucosa there is a layer of loose fibrous connective tissue with blood vessels, and deeper there is a muscular layer. So we have discussed organs of the female reproductive tract, and now let's go to the additional gland of female reproductive system. It's mammary gland. And mammary gland, it provides secretion of milk, and it's needed for the nutrition of a baby after birth and during some months or years of life. And let's look at the structure of mammary gland. So the mammary glands are modified glands of the skin. Here we can see them, and they derive from skin during embryonic development. And they consist of 15-25 lobes separated by dense interlobar connective tissue, and this connective tissue, it contains some amount of fat. And here we can see its skin, its underlying pectoral muscle, and skin is connected with excretory ducts of the mammary gland. Here we can see secretory units which produce milk, and they are opened into the ducts, and these units are surrounded by loose fibrous connective tissue which forms the lobules. Here we can see lobules of the mammary gland, and there are intralobular ducts which excite from the lobules, and they form interlobular ducts. Here we can see them. Interlobular ducts, they are going and they form widened regions which are called lactiferous sinuses. Here we can see them. They collect some milk from the ducts, and they are going to the excretory duct which are opened on the nipple. And here we can see lobules, which are formed by secretory units and intralobular ducts, and surrounding loose fibrous connective tissue, it's stroma. And between the lobules there are septa. They are formed by dense fibrous connective tissue, interlobular septa. And this septa, they contain also some amount of adipose tissue. It's located between the lobules. And more than half of the volume of mammary gland is formed by connective and adipose tissues. And secretory tissue, it doesn't take more than half of the volume of mammary gland before the pregnancy or before the lactation. And here we can see secretory units. So in the structure, mammary glands are compound branched alveolar glands, and here we can see branched secretory units, alveolar units, and they are compound because ducts are branched. And the excretory duct of each lobe, also called lactiferous duct, has its own opening on the nipple. And beneath the nipple, the dilated lactiferous ducts, they form lactiferous sinuses, and it's reservoir of the milk. So here we can see the typical structure of the mammary gland. And the secretory units, those units, they are alveoli. Here we can see alveolar units. They are lined by simple columnar or sometimes cuboidal epithelium. And here we can see those secretory cells which produce milk. And it's beginning of the duct. And the cells, the secretory units, are surrounded by special cells which are called myoepithelial cells. And those cells we have seen in salivary glands also. So myoepithelial cells, they are special cells of the glands which have ectodermal origin. They are salivary glands, sweat glands, mammary glands, lacrimal glands, and they surround secretory units, and their contractions, they push out secretory products from the secretory cells, and they help to release these products through the ducts into the ducts. And in the mammary glands, those secretory those myoepithelial cells of secretory units, they are sensitive for oxytocin, which usually causes contractions of the myocytes of myometrium, and also it has target cells which are myoepithelial cells of mammary gland. And after the release of oxytocin, they are contracted and they push out some amount of milk from the secretory units. So it activates lactation, and it helps in the release of milk. And here we can see mammary gland histological slide. Here we can see lobules, and they contain numerous secretory units. Their lumens are dilated, they are filled with milk, and there are interlobular connective tissue with interlobular ducts, smaller and bigger, and also interlobular connective tissue. It's dense fibrous connective tissue. It contains lobules of adipose tissue. It's fat, which forms the volume of the mammary gland. And between the secretory units, there is loose fibrous connective tissue, which forms stroma of the lobules. And here we can see lobules. They have intralobular stroma and secretory units, and here we can see them on the sections. And between them there are septa. They are present here. They are darker than intralobular connective tissue, and they separate neighboring lobules. And the lactiferous duct, it has two-layered epithelium. Basal layer are cuboidal, basal cells are cuboidal, and superficial cells are columnar. So this type of epithelium is stratified columnar, or sometimes it may be stratified cuboidal. And here we can see lactiferous ducts, and they have two-layered epithelium, stratified cuboidal or columnar. And ducts are opened on the nipple, and they release the milk on the nipple. And let's look at the development of the mammary gland. So mammary gland, it develops as a result of invagination of the ectoderm, dermal ectoderm. They are derivative of skin, and here we can see formation of the branched system of ducts and lobules of the mammary glands. And here we can see changes of mammary glands during life, and we can see different features of the structure. So here we can see mammary gland, which we have discussed before. It's mammary gland during the lactation, when it's producing the milk. After birth of child, mammary gland produces milk and it's needed for lactation, production of milk. So secretory units are present, they are well developed and they produce milk. But this structure isn't typical for entire life of woman. So before the first pregnancy, in young girls, in young women, mammary gland, it has this type of structure. There are lobules, there are ducts, but ducts are the endpoints of the glandular tissue. So secretory units are absent here, and they aren't present in the mammary gland before the first pregnancy. Connective tissue is present here, adipose tissue also is present, but the final development of a mammary gland will happen during the first pregnancy. And here we can see formation of mammary gland during the pregnancy. There is progesterone, which activates formation of placenta. It activates changes in the endometrium, and also it activates formation of the secretory units at the ends of the ducts. So here we can see developing secretory units. They are still not producing milk, but they are developing here under influence of progesterone. And after birth of baby, prolactin activates lactation. Those secretory units, they become to be active, and they produce milk, which is released through the ducts, through the nipple to outer environment, and it's used for the nutrition of baby. And here we can see those units, so their functioning is activated by prolactin, its hormone of adenohypophysis. And after the finishing of lactation, which can last for some months or some days or sometimes some years, it's individual. And after this finishing, without activation by prolactin, secretory units are decreased in size, so they have rudimentary structure. They almost are reduced, but they are present, which differs mammary gland of woman which had lactation from young woman which didn't have any pregnancy. And this is a result of this lactation. So the final size of mammary gland will occur only after the pregnancy and complete cycle of lactation. And mammary gland after this lactation will be usually increased compared to the size before the pregnancy, before the first pregnancy. And there are three hormones which have target cells in the mammary glands. Development of mammary gland is controlled by progesterone during the pregnancy. Lactation is activated by prolactin or lactotrophic hormone, which is produced by the adenohypophysis. And oxytocin, it has target cells, smooth myocytes, which push out secretory products from the cells, so it helps in the release of milk. So three hormones, progesterone, prolactin, and oxytocin, they can have influence on the mammary glands. And here we can see picture which shows mammary gland before pregnancy, non-active mammary gland. It's lactiferous duct and intralobular collecting ducts, and its terminal ductules of acini, but secretory units are absent here. And its intralobular stroma and intralobular stroma between the lobules. It contains mainly fat, so only ducts are present in non-lactating mammary gland. And here we can see ducts. Here we can see two-layered epithelium of duct, and in other ducts, adipose tissue and interlobular connective tissue stroma. But secretory units aren't present here. And pregnancy induces the formation of terminal branches of ducts and the alveoli in the first half of pregnancy, and its effect of progesterone, and also estrogens particularly are involved in this. And here we can see the ducts, and there are developing It's inactive mammary gland, and in the active during the late pregnancy there are well-developed alveoli. Here we can see them, and they begin to produce some amount of milk, and this process will be activated after childbirth. So here we can see active mammary gland. Its volume increases after childbirth because of development of secretory units. And volume of gland doesn't have any influence of the amount of the produced milk, because it depends on the amount of glandular tissue which will develop during the pregnancy. And volume of mammary gland without lactation, before pregnancy or after the pregnancy, without lactation, it depends on amount of fat in the mammary gland. So when some woman has lost her body weight, body fat, also mammary glands, they are decreased in size. And also when someone is getting more fat, mammary glands are increased in size. So it doesn't connect it with amount of glandular tissue. And the mammary gland, cells of mammary gland, they provide production of milk, and there are two ways to release secretory products. Proteins of milk, they are released via exocytosis. It's merocrine secretion. Here we can see merocrine secretion. It's exocytosis. And also lipids of milk, they are released by apocrine secretion. Apical points of the cells, they are separated from another part of the cell, and those drops are present in milk. So two ways of secretion are present in the cells of mammary gland, and secretion is stimulated by prolactin or lactotrophic hormone. And here we can see secretory cells of the alveoli of mammary gland. They produce some amount of milk, which is released in the duct, and from the ducts it's released to outer environment. And myoepithelial cells, with their contractions, they help to push out this milk from the cells and from the alveoli to push out into the following collecting ducts. Here we can see active mammary gland with duct and secretory cells. There are lobules, and between them there are layers of connective tissue. It's interlobular connective tissue, and we can see those numerous alveoli. And here we can see lactating gland, active gland with numerous alveoli. We can see all those bubbles. They are secreting alveoli of the mammary glands. So students, that's all. And thank you for your attention.